In your lesson this week, it talks about separation of powers, focusing very much on the U.S. and its model. Uh, for interest of an alternate model, I'd like to talk about the parliamentary system that really is much more common in most countries than it is in the U.S. Typically, the U.S. is somewhat of an outlier on this in the way we're established, with a very separate executive, legislative, and judicial branch. And as I say, most countries are not organized this way. They're in a parliamentary system of some form or another. So I think it's useful to look at this in regards to how we talk about separation of powers and explain a little bit about the parliamentary system. Basically, in practice, the parliamentary system will really have two branches of government, if you will: the legislative slash executive and the judicial. And what happens with a parliamentary system is the country will go to elections. Uh, the party that gets the most votes then runs the government, both from the executive and the legislative branches. And that's a very simplified version of it. Because what happens in practice most often is historically, most countries have had a somewhat center left, center right party, and then some smaller parties that will also run for office and usually get some people in the assembly, the legislature. These smaller parties really range the gamut. Historically, they've had like farmers' parties, workers' parties, communist parties still exist in some areas. More recently, the Green Party uh, has gathered quite a bit more attention and quite a bit more votes. They usually are in most European parliaments now, to some degree or another. But what happens then is that the party that gets the most votes, even if it's not an absolute majority, will then um, sort of go to other parties of a similar ideological bent. You have your center left, you'll probably go, typically, the way the pattern was, you'll go to somewhat further left parties. You might go to the Green Party because you'll have a lot in common, etc. And then you form the government. Okay. Uh, and this is the sort of the ideal version of it. It's really gotten messed up though in recent years. And let me use Germany as an example because for many years they were viewed as one of the most stable, the strongest parliamentary systems in the world, really. And in Germany, you had the Christian Democrats slash Christian Socialists. They were really one party, but you had the Christian Democrats who were somewhat rightish, not terribly so, but to the right. And you had the Social Democrats who were again somewhat to the left. And typically they would bring in, other smaller parties and form a very stable coalition. Well, that started to really go to hell uh, a few years ago. And the big reason for this was the rise of what is called the Allianz für Deutschland, the Alliance for Germany, AFD. And the AFD is far right. Um, there are those who argue that it's actually a neo-Nazi party. Uh, whether you go to that degree or not, I don't know, but it is very, very far right. And they started getting a lot more attention and started getting a lot more votes. And the one thing that all the other parties in Germany agreed to, essentially, we have to keep the AFD out of power. We do not want a party this far right, especially with our history, this far right in the government. So this became the sort of the touchstone for the German political classes. The AFD stays out of power. Okay, so 2021 2020 and 2021, 2020 were the elections. And the results were that none of the major parties received anywhere close to a majority. The somewhat rightish Christian Democrats, in fact, were essentially sort of wiped out in those elections. And as a result, there was this big thrust to form some sort of government that did not have the AFD in it. Okay. So in 2021, they formed what was called the Traffic Light Coalition, which was it was named for the party's colors, and this consisted of the Social Democrats, leftish party, the Free Democrats, which were to the right of the Christian Democrats, but not way out there. They were sort of the pro-business party, and the Green Party. So you had, as I say, party colors, uh, red, yellow, and green. Well, the problem with this government, though, was that with these three parties, they didn't agree on anything. I mean, it really, the government almost came to a standstill, very honestly, and had really real troubles in dealing with domestic issues, particularly, I will say, immigration. Because let me, as a sort of a side note here, uh, immigration is a huge issue in Western Europe now. And this is one of the reasons why the right wing parties are doing much better. There is almost as much, if not as much, public anxiety about immigration coming into Western European countries. Okay, but they could not agree on anything, and it just sort of the government just sort of limped along, had troubles making decisions about anything because all the parties in it disagreed. Finally, at the end of 2024, it became such that the government just collapsed totally. New elections. In this case, the Christian Democrats came back fairly strongly, nowhere near a majority again. The Social Democrats did okay. They came in third place. So you had the Christian Democrats first, the Social Democrats third. Second place party, Alliance for Deutschland, the far right wing party. So what they've done, and the government they have, as I'm recording this, is another coalition government with the right wing uh, Christian Democrats and the left wing Social Democrats forming a government. Okay. I think it's fair to say we're going to see some issues here again because these are the parties have always fought each other. And so now we've got a fresh coalition, but of the two major parties on either wing. And we have the AFD, the far right party, sitting in parliament with, the second highest number of elected assembly people, and they're completely cut out of the government. This is not necessarily going to go over well with a lot of the German people. However, that's the situation. So you get these weird sorts of situations where, yeah, the parliamentary system probably is more democratic because, and a lot of people argue this, because this way the executive is sort of beholden to the legislature and vice versa. And so in the perfect world, it represents the will of the people more. However, as I say, really over the last 10 years, especially with the rise of very right wing parties, it's starting to show some real signs of trouble and ultimately might not be as efficient or effective as our three branches of government system. And Lord knows, that's got a lot of issues as far as effectiveness and the fighting going on between legislative and and executive branches and judicial branch. But so keep this in mind when we talk about the stuff we're talking about this week. It's very much U.S. centric. It's not necessarily the model that most of the world uses, uh, but all the governing models now, in some way or another, are showing some signs of distress. And it will be interesting to see how this all develops. Thank you.